Hello, welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this slide is we're going to be looking at some common mistakes that you may have used before or that a lot of other students will use in their creative writing and how to rectify those mistakes. So what I mean by basically common mistakes is basically some common elements that often get done not very well in story writing and how to eliminate these sorts of common errors from your story writing. So we're going to be looking at mainly, as I said, things that are used not very well, some devices that are quite often overused, and even just things in broad storytelling terms. We're not going to so much focus on language as such as things like stereotypes and cliches, nor are we going to be focusing on grammar and spelling, because those are more points about grammar and spelling and just finding the right kinds of language. What we're mainly going to be focusing on is just the entire story itself. So how you can fix the entire story so that it has a lot more meaning than just basically the words in it. So I'll explain what I mean as we go. So the first common mistake, and probably the most common one, which is the telling all. As in that example, the boy got into a fight, he lost, his feelings were hurt. As in describing exactly who does what provides really no drama, no interest, and really it doesn't connect with their audience. Now the reason for that is if I read a story like that, I don't feel anything for them. It seems like a generic boy getting into a generic fight. I don't really attach myself to that character at all. However, if it's someone who is poor and vulnerable, then it provokes basically my imagination, and it provokes, should I say, those times where I may have been a poor, vulnerable boy who would have been tormented during his high school life. So provoking imagination is really one of the key things that a story should be trying to do. So really by describing things, by showing everything that happens, by giving some depth to the character rather than just telling us everything about him, because there's no mystery to them then. There's nothing to indicate something which is significant, and particularly if you just keep describing them in such a way where you're telling us everything about them, it gets boring after a while. We don't want to hear everything about everyone. We want to just experience the story for the way that they see it. So by telling things, you're losing that, and by showing them, you are giving the experience more than giving the story. As I said, you don't have to narrate. You don't have to tell us everything that goes on. We will be able to pick it up. And that's something that particularly when a lot of young writers and writers when they're starting out will do is they'll do exactly that. They'll try and tell us everything so we get the story. But you can just leave us breadcrumbs. We'll work it out. So focus more on description. That's probably the best way to rectify this. All right, writing like a movie. Come across this quite a lot. Whereas, because you probably watch films more than you read books, and yes, very sad to say that books are on the way out and books are declining, and yes, films are taking over. This often does ruin creative writing though, and the reason for that is because so many stories are written like they are in a film. Now, film and prose writing don't go together. They aren't a perfect match. All right, and the reason for that is because the things that work really well on a screen don't work well in a story. And that's basically because of the fact that visuals and action don't really develop that well in a story unless you spend a lot of time on them. So the really big flashy things, the artistic side of things and the basically the big explosions that we're all attracted to, the old action thrillers, don't really come across in the book because of the fact that they are slow. They are paced far more slowly, and because of the fact that they don't really connect with their audience in much the same way. And often students will focus on the big explosion part and not the softer sections of the film, the ones which really get us hooked and really engrossed into it to make this explosions relevant. So think about it this way. You want to have your story connect with an audience before you start bringing in the actions. And because you've only got a short story, you really don't have a lot of time to develop that connection. So to write like a movie is basically going to ruin your creative story. And the reason for that, as I said, is because we won't be able to see it like it is a movie. We won't be able to read it like that. And we'd have to do a lot of our own interpretation, which basically it disconnects us from the story. So let's put it this way. If Transformers was a book, would people read it? Now, some of you, might read it. And yes, Transformers has been a book on multiple occasions. But the thing is, it wouldn't be one you would study in English. And the reason for that is basically because of the fact that there's no real substance, but also because of the fact that it's very, very hard for big blockbuster action thrillers to get anything other than a thrill ride out of them. And that thrill ride doesn't really come across into the narrative prose that well. So to avoid writing like movies is a fairly good step to writing not only stories, which come across better in writing, but also allow you to basically get the ideas of detail and emotion and sensory language developed in such a way where you're really addressing what is good in story writing rather than just sort of writing something that's Hollywood and cliche and all those things. So basically avoid writing like a movie. Next thing is writing too much conversation. Now I know, again, this is one of the byproducts by people watching way too many movies, is that they'll go the other extreme and they'll write purely in terms of conversations that they have. Now, as I said, while they're fantastic in a play or a film, they don't come across well in particularly narratives, and they're very, very hard to find context for conversations, and they can drag on after a while, particularly if you have conversations about really uninteresting things. And in order to sort of have a consistent timepiece, what they'll do is they'll have stories which will go, hello, how are you? What did you do today? Oh, well, I just went down to... No one's interested in that. No one's interested in that. So you can exclude conversations that are not adding to the story and just basically write them as a paraphrase version. So just to say that some time was spent with small talk, and you can do that in one sentence and go back on to telling the story again. To focus on describing them, and particularly the way that they are talking to each other might be a lot more interesting than the things that they are saying. So try and avoid too much conversation. Obviously, you still want dialogue in stories, and dialogue is still quite important. But to do it at the expense of description and sensory and emotive language and really developing a sense of someone wanting to be involved and engaged in the story is not really recommended, and something that really does detract from storytelling. So if you've got big, long slabs of dialogue, try and cut them down a little bit. All right. Next thing is basically too many visuals and description. Now, visuals and description are quite good, but you can do it too much. So because of the fact that most of you see the world first and experience it through other senses second, so as in you're more likely to react to things that you see than things that you hear or smell or so forth, then you look at it in such a way where you overcomplicate the visuals and add too many of them. So you ignore other sensory language, but also that they basically drag along a little bit. But first of all, look at senses, because they do help your stories come to life a lot more. And basically the reason why is by incorporating those other things, people can basically engage with your story on a sort of three-dimensional level, where they're not just looking at it like it's a painting, but really opening up the world and being able to fit inside of it. So by using smells and sounds and those sorts of things, you're really sort of invoking that emotional attachment to a place and really getting people to go deeper into it. As I said before, overdoing description can make a story to drag on. You do need it to progress occasionally. So if you're describing a teapot for 2 paragraphs, you've described that teapot for far too long. Unless it has some sort of symbolic relevance or something that is deep and fascinating, if you're just describing it in terms of its visuals, then you're going way too long. You don't have to go through every single thing that you see. The next thing, and this is one I come across as well. Now, this one is a very risky device. It's not necessarily one that is a common mistake. However, it's one that's not done very well quite often. And as I said, it's a fantastic storytelling device if it's used well, but normally it is not. And the reason for that is that writing in present tense is really something that you can only do if you've mastered it. If you've mastered the grammar of writing in present tense and avoid the temptation to go back to past tense. Now, if you've got stories dropping in and out of tense, first of all, it sets off alarm bells for teachers, but second of all, it loses meaning. So definitely practice with that idea of writing in present tense, but only really use it if you've mastered and if you've really got the hang of it. So, as I said, it works as really well, and it really helps to, present tense is really good for invoking a sense of immediacy and action and really helping your story move at a much quicker pace. However, done poorly, it just means that people are going back and forth and saying, well, didn't that already happen? No, what, when, where? All these things. It's just very confusing. So practice it before you use it, basically. Don't rush in and use a present tense story and go, oh, I'm going to write this in present tense because it's going to be so cool, but not be able to do it that well. So it's just one of those things that just takes a lot of practice, and make sure that when you can do it, or when you do use present tense, that you can do it properly. All right, next thing is to basically go to a sense of being too extreme. Now, having extreme ideas are good, but they need to have some sort of balance, which means they can't be too crazy. And the reason for that is by having a story that's too utterly crazy. First of all, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to explain things. And second of all, it sort of doesn't come across as having any depth, and particularly having the attachments that you need, which you only have a small time to develop. So if you make everything beyond believable, the audience sort of loses connection. Now, that's not to say that you don't have a sciencey sort of thing, but if you have things that are too crazy, you're going to be spending too much time trying to justify them all. So emotional points get lost, all those things. If you're writing a novel and you're doing it well, then yeah, okay, come up with some really crazy ideas. And don't be afraid to come up with some interesting ideas. But if you go ideas that are too far-fetched, it's just too hard to care about them. So unfortunately, as much as space aliens fighting communists and warships is a great idea, and I love to read the story personally, in fact, finding that artwork really makes me want to read the story behind it. But it's something that will take me a while to sort of get into. And certainly if I was just looking at it straight away and going, why is this about space aliens? Why are they in warships? If I'm asking those questions at the beginning, then I'm not going to be really giving your work any serious thought. And as I said, if you're one of those really good writers who can convey it very well, go ahead and try it. But if you're someone who's not all that confident, maybe just stick to very simple ideas and just focus on building them up, rather than trying to go with something that's big and flashy and extravagant and doesn't really have any sort of meaning. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do with story writing, is creating meaning through the words that you use, through the characters, through the storytelling, through the experiences, and the way that you're going to be marked on them, the way that your outcomes are going to be focused, is going to be on making sure that you can actually describe and connect and do all those things that are required of you, and be able to write text which basically do all the things that the outcomes are asking you to do. Not necessarily come up with big, extravagant, flashy stories, because there's no outcome for that. There are outcomes for deep stories. There are outcomes which enable you to sort of make a link between the world and you, but nothing on space aliens. So unless those space aliens have some sort of quest for home or belonging, or some sort of thing that we can relate to, maybe just stick to humans for now. Otherwise, that's basically about it. I hope this helps you, and I certainly hope that you can have a look at your story writing and just make sure that you find ways that not only can improve your writing, but also to eliminate some of these common mistakes from your work. And until next time, I'll see you later.